She was black, beautiful, and broke. Singing on a street corner in the freezing cold for loose change and strangers who never stopped to listen. He was the most feared Korean mafia boss on the East Coast. Paralyzed from the waist down, sitting in a carbon fiber wheelchair worth more than most people's cars, with a dragon tattoo climbing his neck and 23 years of blood and silence behind his eyes. Two people who had no business being in the same world, but the world had other plans. His wife, the woman he had given everything to, was already in a federal building across the city, sitting across from FBI agents, selling 11 years of his secrets for the price of her own freedom. And she did it without a single trembling word. He didn't know yet. He only knew that when he heard that black woman's voice rise and then pull back, hold a note and then release it like something too painful to keep, something inside him cracked open that 23 years of power had never touched. He crossed the street, put $500 in her case, said 4 words, and walked away. But what neither of them knew was that this was not a chance encounter. This was the beginning of the only thing that would save him, and the only thing that would destroy everything he had built was already done. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There are men who are built by the world before they have a chance to build themselves. Jang Hyan Wu was one of those men. You would not have known it to look at him. Not in those years when he walked, when he filled a room with nothing more than the weight of his silence, when lieutenants lowered their eyes and rivals crossed the street to avoid passing too close. You would have looked at him and seen power. Clean, cold, absolute. The kind of power that does not announce itself because it does not need to. What you would not have seen was the boy who arrived in New York at 11 years old, with a father who owed money to men far worse than he would ever become. You would not have seen the years in Flushing, the hunger that was not dramatic but constant, the particular shame of a child who understands too early that the world is not arranged for people like him. You would not have seen the moment, he was 16, when a man named Park Sung-jin put a hand on his shoulder in a parking garage and said, quietly, without ceremony, "You are wasted where you are." And what Hyun Woo felt in that moment was not fear. It was recognition, as if someone had finally looked at him directly. That was how it began. Not with violence, not with a choice that felt like a choice, with a hand on a shoulder and the terrible relief of being seen. By 30, he controlled more territory in 3 states than most legitimate businesses manage in a decade. By 35, his name was spoken in tones that varied depending on who was speaking. Federal prosecutors said it like a problem they had not yet solved. Rivals said it like a prayer they hoped would not be answered. And his own men said it like something between a title and a warning. By 47, he said it to himself every morning in a mirror above a sink he could no longer reach standing up. And he was no longer entirely sure what it meant. 8 months. That was how long he had been in the chair. 8 months since the warehouse. 8 months since a bullet that was never meant for him found him anyway, because he had been somewhere he should never have been, making decisions from the wrong part of himself, the part that was still reachable by anger. By her. He had never told anyone that. He had allowed his men to construct a narrative around it. Ambush, enemy action, the acceptable mythology of a man at war. It was easier. And Hyun Woo had spent his entire adult life choosing what was easier over what was true. The chair changed things. Not immediately, not in any way he could name. But there is something that happens to a man when the architecture of his power is suddenly made visible. When the body that commanded rooms must now be pushed through them. When the silence he once controlled now has an edge to it, a quality of pity he can feel from 3 feet away. He did not become a different man. He became a more honest one. And honesty, in the life he had built, was the one thing he had no room for. His wife understood this before he did. Caitlin had married the myth. She had been drawn to the gravity of it, to the particular glamour of a man everyone feared, to the safety, ironic as it sounds, of belonging to someone untouchable. For 11 years, she had worn that belonging like a second skin. She had learned to sleep through phone calls at 2 in the morning. She had learned to smile at dinners where she understood none of the subtext and all of the danger. She had learned, most importantly, to need very little from him, because Hyan Wu gave very little that was real. What she had not planned for was the chair. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Because the chair made real what she had always half known. That she had not married a man. She had married a symbol. And symbols, when they crack, leave you with nothing to hold on to. She had been gone in every way that mattered for at least a year before the morning she stood in their living room with packed luggage and said what she said. The words were clean, almost rehearsed. I was gone a long time before today. And then the door closed, and the sound it made was very quiet. And Hyan Wu sat alone in a room full of expensive things and understood, for the first time, that he had never once asked her to stay. He had never asked anyone for anything. That was the root of it. That was the thing no one who feared him could have imagined. That the most controlled man in 3 states had built his entire life around never needing, because needing had always felt, to the boy in Flushing, like the most dangerous thing a person could do. And it was on a Friday morning, 6 days before the walls began to fall, that he first heard her voice. The corner of 35th and Broadway in Koreatown was not a remarkable place. It sat between a laundry that opened at 6 and a restaurant that had been closed for renovation for so long that the paper over the windows had begun to yellow at the edges. The sidewalk cracked in 2 places. A streetlight above it buzzed faintly in the dark, and nobody had reported it because nobody who passed through there regularly believed anyone would come to fix it. It was the kind of corner that existed in every city. Present, functional, entirely invisible. Leila Monroe had chosen it precisely for that reason. She had learned, in 2 years of singing on streets, that the wrong corner destroyed everything. Too much foot traffic, and people walked through the music like weather. Too little, and you were performing for pigeons and your own doubt. This corner had a wall behind her. Good acoustics, the sound bounced back. And just enough morning commuters moving at just enough speed that some of them slowed without meaning to. She was not looking for applause. She had stopped looking for applause sometime around the 4th month after her mother died, when she realized she was not singing for audiences anymore. She was singing because the silence inside her apartment had become a physical thing, something with weight and texture, and the only way to move it was to fill the air with sound. She was singing the morning Hyan Wu's chair rolled to a stop on the other side of the street. She did not see him. She rarely looked up during the early songs. The first 40 minutes were always for her mother, a private ritual she had never explained to anyone and never intended to. Her eyes were closed, or cast down, or fixed on the middle distance where nothing particular lived. Her voice was doing what it always did in those moments, reaching for something it could not name, stretching toward the upper register of a note and then pulling back, not because it could not hold it, but because the restraint was the point. Because grief does not shout. Grief hovers. Grief sits just below the surface of a held note and makes itself felt through the pressure of what is almost said. Hyan Wu heard all of this. He could not have explained how. He was not a man who spoke the language of music. He had grown up around it only incidentally. His mother had sung while cooking, low and distracted, songs he could not remember the words to now. And in his adult life, music had been background, atmosphere, something that played in rooms where deals were made and meant nothing in particular. He had never once sat still and listened to someone sing. He sat still now. Derek, his security, noticed the chair had stopped and said nothing. In 8 months, he had learned the difference between a stop that required action and a stop that required silence. This was silence. He stepped back 2 paces and watched the street. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Hyan Wu counted them without meaning to, the way he counted everything. A habit from years of needing to know exactly how long anything lasted. When Leila finished and turned and found 3 large men and 1 man in a carbon fiber wheelchair watching her from across the street, her expression moved through surprise, then assessment, then a careful neutrality that told him she had learned to read situations quickly and had decided this one was not immediately dangerous. She looked at the empty case on the ground. He crossed the street. He placed $500 in the case without flourish, without waiting for her reaction, without the performance of generosity that people with money often cannot resist. He was already turning the chair when she said it. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I do it because I want to." He left. But something stayed behind. Some residue of those 4 minutes and 17 seconds that he could not locate precisely, and therefore could not dismiss. He had trained himself, over decades, to dismiss anything he could not locate precisely. Ambiguity was a liability. Feelings that did not have names were feelings that could not be managed. He had built an empire on the principle that the unexamined thing is the dangerous thing. That evening, alone in the apartment that still smelled faintly of Caitlin's perfume because he had not opened the windows, he found himself thinking about the way she had pulled back from the top of that note. The restraint. The deliberate withholding of the full sound. He recognized it. That was the problem. He recognized it from the inside. He went back the next Friday, and the one after that. On the 4th Friday, she was not there, and he found the note, and he sent Derek to find out who she was. And when the file came back, Leila Monroe, Baltimore, 26. Ruth Monroe, deceased, 40 square meters in Hell's Kitchen, 3 months behind on rent. He read it twice. Not because the information was complicated, because something in the plainness of it, in the sheer unguarded smallness of her circumstances, hit him in a place he had spent 23 years walling off. She owed nothing to anyone dangerous. She had no angles. She had no agenda. She was simply a woman who had lost her mother and was singing about it on a street corner because she had not found another way to carry it. He paid 6 months of her rent through a shell company and told no one. He did not examine why. That was the first mistake. Not the payment, the not examining. Because Hyan Wu had survived 2 decades in a world that killed men for their blind spots, and he was developing one, quietly, on a street corner in Koreatown. And he was allowing it to grow because it was the first warm thing he had felt in 8 months, and the cold had become very hard to live in. And it was in that same week, while he was learning for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to do something for no reason except that it felt right, that Caitlin was sitting in a glass office on the 42nd floor of a federal building in Lower Manhattan, speaking carefully into a recording device, trading 11 years of overheard conversations for the possibility of a life that did not end in a cell. She spoke for 4 hours. She was thorough. The call came on a Tuesday. Hyan Wu was at his desk, a habit he had kept from before the chair. The same desk, the same position. Because there were things a man holds on to when everything else has shifted beneath him. His attorney, a careful Korean American named James Song, who had represented him for 14 years, and had the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent too long knowing too much, spoke without preamble. That was how Hyan Wu had trained everyone around him to speak. No softening, no runway, just the information, cleanly delivered, and then silence for him to process it. What James Song delivered that Tuesday was not clean. Caitlin had spoken to the FBI for 4 hours. She had provided names, dates, locations, financial structures, the architecture of 11 years of proximity to something that the federal government had been trying to map for most of a decade. She had not done it carelessly. She had done it the way she did everything, with precision, with composure, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who had decided on a direction and was not going to do it halfway. She had 72 hours before the information became irreversible. James Song said, "We have options. I can walk you through them." Hyan Wu said, "Give me an hour." He sat at the desk after the call ended and did not move for a long time. Outside the window, New York conducted itself with its usual indifference. Traffic, voices, the low, continuous roar of a city that had never once paused to consider any individual life within it. He had always found that comforting. The city's indifference had felt, for years, like kinship. Daniel Kwan arrived within 20 minutes. He had a way of knowing when he was needed that Hyan Wu had long since stopped questioning. He came in, stood in the center of the room, and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. A list. 4 options, numbered, each with a projected outcome. Daniel had always thought in lists. It was why Hyan Wu had trusted him for 20 years, because the man could not be moved by emotion, only by logic. And logic, in their world, had generally kept people alive. Hyan Wu looked at the list. He looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it once and placed it at the edge of the desk and said, "Get out, Daniel." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Daniel Kwan was not a man who was told to leave. In 20 years, it had not happened once. He stood for a moment in the geometry of his own disbelief, and then he left, and the door closed. And Hyan Wu was alone again with the traffic and the roar and the particular quality of a decision that had not yet been made, but had already, in some place below thought, been decided. He could not stop thinking about what Leila had said on the street corner at 1 a.m. It had been 3 nights earlier. He had gone there unable to sleep, not an uncommon occurrence. But that night the apartment had been particularly airless, particularly loud with the kind of silence that accumulates in rooms where something has ended. He had not expected her to be there. She was sitting on the pavement with her back against the wall and her eyes open and her phone vivo around her neck, not listening to anything, just existing in the way that exhausted people exist, present, but not quite arrived. She had not been startled by him. That had struck him then, and struck him again now. Most people, in the presence of Hyun Woo and two security personnel at 1 in the morning on an empty street, arranged their faces into caution. She had simply looked at him and said, with the directness of someone too tired for performance, "You're real, or I fell asleep out here again." They had talked for 2 hours, or rather, she had talked, and he had listened in the way he never listened, which was without agenda, without cataloging information for future use, without the constant low hum of strategic processing that had accompanied every conversation of his adult life. She talked about her mother, about the hospital, about the specific cruelty of a Tuesday morning when the phone rings and the voice on the other end says the thing you have been preparing for, and it turns out preparation means nothing. Nothing at all. And the world simply continues and expects you to continue with it. He had said, "Your mother heard you. Every day." She had looked at him. "That is more than most people have," he said. It was the truest thing he had said to another person in years. He knew it when he said it. He also knew, sitting at his desk the next day, with Daniel Kwan's folded list at the edge of his vision, that the man who said true things and the man who ran what he ran could not continue to occupy the same body. One of them was going to have to go. He picked up the phone and called James Song. "I want to cooperate," he said. James Song was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Hyun Woo counted. "You understand what that means," Song said. It was not a question. "I understand completely. They will take everything. The structures, the assets, I understand completely," Hyun Woo said again, and his voice was the same voice he had always used. The voice that did not waver, that did not invite negotiation. Only now it was aimed at a different outcome. "Set the meeting." What he did not know, what no one in his immediate world knew yet, was that Marcus Reed had already been informed. Marcus Reed, who had walked out of Hyun Woo's life with his wife and his secrets, was not a man who waited for things to happen to him. He was a man who had spent 5 years learning the precise shape of Hyun Woo's operation while appearing to launder money through legitimate real estate, and he had connections with the Beck family that predated his relationship with Caitlin by 3 years. The affair had been convenient. The access it provided had been the point. He made 2 calls the night the cooperation agreement was initiated. The first call arranged for 2 men to be positioned near Koreatown on Friday morning. The second call was to a federal contact of his own, a hedge, a contingency, the backup plan of a man who always had one. Marcus Reed had not survived in the spaces between legitimate and illegitimate worlds by being careless. He had survived by ensuring that no matter which way the situation fell, he had already placed himself on the winning side. What he had not calculated, the thing that would undo him, specifically and completely, was that Hyun Woo had been building the cooperation file for 3 weeks before making the call. And in that file, meticulously documented, cross-referenced, delivered to James Song in sealed increments, was the complete financial architecture of Marcus Reed's relationship with the Beck family. Every transaction, every communication, every carefully structured arrangement that Reed had believed was invisible because the man who knew about it had every incentive to stay silent. The incentive had changed. On Friday morning, Derek saw the 2 men before they reached the corner. What happened in the 40 seconds that followed was efficient and left no recoverable evidence. The 2 men left the neighborhood. They did not return. Leila Monroe, who was adjusting the settings on a new microphone that had appeared outside her apartment door that morning in unmarked packaging, noticed nothing unusual except that the man in the black wheelchair arrived slightly earlier than normal and sat slightly closer than he usually did. She looked at the microphone, then at him. "That was you," she said. "I have no idea what you're referring to," he said. "You are a terrible liar for someone who has clearly lied a great deal." "Most of my lies were for people who weren't paying attention." She laughed. He had not heard her laugh before. It was sudden and unguarded, and it moved across her face the way light moves across water. And Jang Hyan Wu, who had not been surprised by a single thing in 23 years, found that he was entirely unprepared for it. Marcus Reed was arrested on a Wednesday. It was not dramatic. The most significant arrests rarely are. 2 federal agents in unremarkable clothing knocked on the door of a hotel suite in Midtown where he had been staying since Caitlin's arrangement with the government had begun to complicate the geography of his life. He opened the door in a bathrobe. He looked at the badges. He looked past them at the hallway, as if checking for an exit that was not there. And then his face did something that faces do in that specific moment. Not collapse, exactly, but settle. The way a structure settles when the last load-bearing thing is removed. Quietly. Completely. Without any of the drama the moment seemed to deserve. The evidence against him was comprehensive. It had come, in its entirety, from the cooperation file that Jang Hyan Wu had spent 3 weeks assembling with the quiet thoroughness of a man who had spent 2 decades building systems and understood, better than anyone, exactly how they could be dismantled. Every transaction Marcus Reed had run through the Beck network. Every communication that had passed between them across 5 years of careful arrangement. Every structure that Reed had believed was invisible because the only man who could see it had always had too much to lose by looking. The losing had changed shape. Caitlin, when she was informed of Reed's arrest, attempted to withdraw her cooperation agreement. Her attorney made the call on a Thursday morning, professionally and without evident emotion, the way attorneys deliver news that is not going to be received well. The federal prosecutor on the other end of the line listened, allowed a brief pause, and explained, in the same professional tone, that the agreement had already been substantially acted upon, that the information she had provided had been cross-referenced with an independent cooperation file of considerably greater depth, and that her current position was materially worse than it had been 7 days ago. She received 8 years. The number was delivered to Hyan Wu by James Song on a Friday afternoon, 3 hours before he went to the coroner. He received it the way he received most information now, without the layered strategic processing, without immediately calculating what it meant for him, without the automatic search for leverage or implication. He simply heard it. He held it for a moment. He thought, briefly and without particular emotion, about a woman in a beige cashmere coat who had stood in his living room and told him she had been gone long before she left. He thought she was probably right. He thought that he had been gone long before she left as well. Gone from himself, specifically. Gone from any version of himself that could have been reached by another person, that could have asked for something real, that could have looked at 11 years of a marriage and understood it as something other than an arrangement that served the larger structure of a life built entirely on the premise that needing was weakness, and weakness was death. He did not feel sorry for her. He did not feel relieved. He felt something quieter than either of those things. Something that did not have a clean name, that sat in the chest without urgency. That was perhaps the first feeling he had experienced in years that was not immediately in service of something else. It was just a feeling, present and purposeless. He allowed it to be there. The corner was cold that evening. Leila was already set up when he arrived. The new microphone on its small stand, the case open on the ground, the oversized plaid coat wrapped around her against the October air. She had pinned the broken zipper on her canvas bag with a new clip, silver instead of gold, and she was running through the first few bars of something he had not heard before, low and exploratory, the way she always started, feeling for the shape of the song before committing to it. She stopped when she saw him. "You're early," she said. "I had a short day." She looked at him the way she had been looking at him for weeks now, directly, without the social architecture that most people erected between themselves and a man like him. It had unsettled him initially, that directness. He had interpreted it as either naivety or recklessness, because those were the only two explanations his experience offered for a person who looked at Jang Hyan Wu without visible caution. He understood now that it was neither. It was simply that she had learned, in the specific school of genuine loss, that most of the things people fear are smaller than the things that have already happened to them. She had buried her mother. She had sung on street corners in the dark. She had carried grief without ceremony or audience for 2 years. A man in an expensive wheelchair with a dragon tattoo on his neck was not, on the scale of things she had already survived, particularly frightening. "What happened today?" she asked. "A great many things ended," he said. She considered this. Is that good or bad? "I don't know yet. Both, I think." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was not going to push further but was not going to pretend she hadn't heard. He had learned that nod. He had catalogued it without meaning to, along with the way she tilted her head when she was deciding whether to sing something or let it go, and the particular stillness that came over her face in the last few bars of a song when she was somewhere else entirely, somewhere the rest of the world did not have access to. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've never asked me anything before," she said. "You just appear and listen." "I know." "So ask." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the city continued. A taxi, a woman with a stroller, the distant percussion of a delivery truck, and the street light above them buzzed its familiar low buzz. And Hyun Woo thought about how strange it was that this corner, this particular crack in the sidewalk and yellowed paper in the window and buzzing light, had become the only place in his life that felt like it had air in it. "When you sing for her," he said, "your mother, does it help?" Leila looked at him for a long moment. "It doesn't bring her back," she said. "That's not what I asked." "No," she said. "It doesn't help. It just makes the not having her feel like something I'm doing instead of something that's happening to me." He absorbed that. "That's the difference," he said quietly. Not to her, exactly. To himself. Between what? Between surviving something and living inside it. She was quiet. Then she said, without looking away from him, "You've been living inside something for a very long time, haven't you?" It was not a question. He did not answer it as one. "Yes," he said. The agreement was finalized the following week. The organization, 23 years of structure, territory, personnel, financial architecture built across 3 states, was formally dissolved across 14 months of proceedings. Most of the assets were seized. Some were negotiated. Daniel Kwan disappeared into a silence that Hyun Woo did not pursue. Others followed. The men who stayed in touch were few and said little, and eventually stopped calling, because there was nothing left to call about. Hyan Wu received 5 years of supervised probation and a prohibition from certain financial activities that his attorney had spent considerable effort narrowing to the most specific possible language. He moved to a smaller apartment. He kept the desk. He kept the chair, obviously. It was not going anywhere. He spent a great deal of time in a silence that was different from the silence that had come before. This one did not buzz with suppressed calculation. It was simply quiet. On Fridays, he went to the corner. On some Tuesdays. Once on a Wednesday when neither of them had planned it and they were both simply there, arriving from different directions, and Leila had looked at him and said, "Oh," and he had said, "Yes." And they had stayed for 2 hours in the October cold while she sang, and he listened, and the city continued its indifferent roar around them. There was no single moment that it became something more. It accumulated, the way most real things accumulate, without announcement, without the dramatic pivot that stories prefer to locate. A conversation that went longer than expected. A silence that was comfortable in a way that surprised them both. The evening she sat on the arm of his chair without thinking about it, and then stayed because neither of them mentioned it. The morning he told her, plainly and without a prepared version, what had happened in the warehouse, and why he had been there, and what it had cost him. Not the mobility, but the particular pride that had put him in that room. She had listened without filling the silence afterward, which was the most precise and generous thing anyone had offered him in years. He did not know what they were. He knew that he had, for the first time in 23 years, stopped constructing the answer to that question in advance. And Leila Monroe, who had spent 2 years singing to a woman who could no longer hear her, found that she had been heard anyway. Not by her mother, but by the listening that her mother had made possible. By the voice that grief had given her. By a Friday morning on an unremarkable corner between a laundry and a closed restaurant, where a man in a black wheelchair had stopped and stayed and counted 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and then crossed the street and said nothing except that he knew what wanting to was worth. The streetlights still buzzed. Nobody had come to fix it. Neither of them would have changed it. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever met someone in the most unexpected place? Someone who had no reason to see you, and yet they were the only one who truly did? Have you ever held on to a version of yourself, built from fear, from survival, from years of believing that needing someone made you weak, only to realize that the walls you built to protect yourself were the very thing keeping you from living? And have you ever had to lose everything you constructed to finally find the one thing that was real? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about redemption, human connection, and the quiet courage it takes to start over, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.